Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Elizabeth Winder, author of Parachute Women, Marianne, Faithfull, Marsha Hunt, Bianca, Jagger, Anita, Pallenberg, and the Women Behind the Rolling Stones. Published by Hachette, was released late last year. Elizabeth is also the author of Marilyn in Manhattan and Pain Party's Work, Sylvia Plath in New York, summer of 1953. So when I was 12, I was obsessed as much as all my peers with the Beatles and the Stones. And if we ever heard about the girlfriends or wives of the musicians, I don't remember. I remember hearing the name Jane Asher, but only because she was the brother of Peter Asher from Peter and Gordon. And then another woman who helped to make the Beatles, Astrid Kircher. And then, as I said, Marianne Faithfull because of As Tears Go By. So it would be a couple of years before I even gasped at the fact that John was married to Cynthia, or that Ringo was wed to Maureen because of her pregnancy, and George to Pattie Boyd. And other than that, the press pretty much kept closed mouths about these hidden figures. Then I even read later that Bill Wyman had been married in 1959 and Charlie Watts in 1964 to the same woman for 47 years and until he died. I love Charlie. It's been 3 years already since he died. These women, unfortunately, were anathema to a rock and roll band whose public persona required availability and adoration. So as years went by, I began to hear about Anita Pallenberg and Bianca and Jerry Hall. I never knew about Marsha Hunt until I read this book, though. And it's a fascinating story of how the Stones evolved and why the women they surrounded themselves with helped shape their wardrobe, their sensibilities, and their music and stardom. So Elizabeth paints a comprehensive picture of all of these partners and the importance they had and still have to the early days of rock and roll. So welcome, Elizabeth. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you.
So I would say, first of all, that it seems as if Anita, who was the one who was first and foremost and most important for several reasons. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. First of all, she was present the longest, because she came on the scene in the middle of 1965 when she met Brian Jones when the Stones were on tour in Germany. And then in 1967, she did the switch from Brian to Keith and stayed with Keith for, in a way, 13 years. So she was there for the longest. But not only that, she was the most influential because she was the most present. I think that she was the most interested in their music. And also she was the most inclined to a rock and roll sort of lifestyle. So she was definitely the most influential for sure.
Yeah, it's funny when I was thinking about her, because you only meet, like, in your life, it seems like maybe 6 people who had the charisma walk into the room and there's nobody else but her in the room all of a sudden. And it's fascinating when you meet them. It doesn't make any difference how big a star you are. They still have this incredible influence over you. And that one, I like the little epigraphs in front of each chapter. They really tell a lot about what goes on. And that first one was when I think of the Rolling Stones, I think of Anita Pallenberg.
Yes, yes. I love that. And, and I was so, that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because I kind of slowly over the course of several years started to see the name Anita Pallenberg pop up so much when it came to the Stones. And she seemed, I realized very quickly, yes, she was the girlfriend. And I think I'd known that for a long time, but I realized very quickly that she was much more than that, and Keith Richards in his wonderful autobiography, Life, talks about her at length and is very open about just how much she influenced him. And, and just how in awe he was of her and still is, and I think still is to this day.
Keith's book was really good because basically it was just Keith talking.
Yes. You get a real sense of his personality and his voice.
Yeah, you definitely do. Well, since you mentioned Brian as the first partner of Anita, let's talk about what is obviously a very tragic story and the trajectory of it.
Yeah, yeah, it is a really tragic story. I think he died in 1969. Of course, he was, I think, only 27 years old. Um, and I think what a lot of people maybe in my age and younger, I mean, kind of younger generations, sometimes forget is that, when you think of the Stones, you think of course, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, but Brian Jones really started the band. And they, of course, started as sort of an R&B sort of band. And when he met Anita, I forget who said this, but there's this wonderful quote, Brian Jones was the only Stone that inhaled. That's of course at first, right?
Right.
I think that what's really key to my book is that aside from Brian Jones, in 1965, the Stones were, well, I wouldn't say they certainly weren't buttoned up, well behaved, but they were absolutely not worldly. Sorry about that. They were not, they were not sophisticated. Not only did they not know about art and fashion, but they weren't even, Mick and Keith, aside from alcohol, they weren't drug users or anything like that. Brian was very into, like he was wild, and he wanted to be known as wild, and he walked the walk, he was experimenting with, Anita might have introduced him to LSD, but he was experimenting with fashion, certainly. He was experimenting with drugs. He was already, wearing a little bit of women's jewelry and that sort of thing. And all of that really exploded when he met Anita. They were absolutely a match, sort of in a way like you could say in today's parlance, people would say twin flames maybe, but they sort of met each other. They even, and I wrote about this in my book, they were the same height, the same size, Brian, all of the Stones were of course very thin, and sort of Anita tall and thin. She was working as a model and as an actress, and they shared each other's clothes. She would wear his pants, he would dress up in her scarves and sometimes even her skirts and boots at night on an acid trip. She would dress him up as Francoise Hardy. So they were sort of like, they were kind of, it was like this boom, explosive meeting. And for a couple years there, they were very much the kind of libertine king and queens of the London scene.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned wearing clothes and the drugs, because the sartorial aspect of the book is amazing, because you described the clothes so well. It's almost like the clothes are a character and the drugs are a character. And everything from, and you're right, they were so inexperienced at the time. And then all of a sudden it seems like LSD just starts figuring in. And then you would talk about a day when it was cocaine, hash oil, LSD, amphetamines all in one day. And
Yeah.
so, but first start with the sartorial, because that was fascinating. You talked about Brian and Anita switching clothes, but everybody, it was not, Astrid, who I mentioned for the Beatles, she came up with the mop tops and the suit
Yes.
and Beatle boots, but we're way beyond that in your book.
Yes, yes. And I've been interested, in the aesthetics of the Stones, and in that whole 60s London movement for decades now. Ever since I was a teenager, I would see pictures of these looks, and I would be so drawn to it. When I really dug into it, because we all sort of know about Carnaby Street and the mod look, which was already well into, had been going on for a couple years by the time, or maybe 1 or 2 years by the time my book starts. But Anita brought something else to it. And she was one of those people, like you said, you walk into a room and somebody else is going to be the bigger, the celebrity. Someone else might be more, aesthetically beautiful, although Anita was incredibly beautiful. But you're going to be drawn to Anita no matter what, and you see that repeatedly. She just had this innate sense of, among other things, style, that was very, very unique to her. And she 100% brought that to the Stones. I think that at first when, and this is, the other thing to remember is, I think maybe Anita was a couple years older than Mick and Keith, but they were all just so young. And London was still just seemed to have the remnants of the post World War II sort of feel to it. So there was still that strong streak of conservatism. When when Mick and Keith first met Anita, they were very scared of her. And typically, especially when, a young, they were boys, when they met her, they kind of reacted against her. They were almost antagonistic towards her because I think they were threatened by her, and they were threatened and confused by Brian. They're thinking all of a sudden she's dressing him up as a girl, or he's wearing her scarf. They're like doing LSD at night. I think that Mick and Keith felt a little bit, especially Mick, felt a little bit left behind. And then very quickly, I think that they fell under her spell. And I think that from Mick's perspective, who has always been and still is very much, well, I'll say this, calculating. He's the business, definitely takes care of the Stones from the business point of view. And I think that he's very much thought from the very beginning, even at that young age, this is where the future is. It's with Anita. It's with somebody like her. If we want to do something different, if we want to really be the rebels and the renegades, we're going to hop onto the Anita train. And they did. And it all happened very fast.
It was funny how Keith said something like, it's okay spending a day with her, but there's no possible way you could spend your life with Anita Pallenberg.
Right.
People like that, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's like, how can I, you can't keep going at this speed, at this pace, and she did everything at that pace. I was constantly just stunned and blown over and so impressed by the incredible, some people seem to be born with this unstoppable sort of energy. And I think that she had that. It's sort of amazing. The pace at which things happen. It's like, how does this, when I was researching the book, so many things were happening in the same month. I'd be like, how did all of this happen in 1 month, in 1 week? But I think that in a way that really mirrors the pace of the 60s. And I think that that's what makes that decade so unique, because even when you think of it from a fashion point of view, fashion changed so quickly from year to year then. I don't think that there has ever been or will be a time that was like that ever again. When you think about it, like if you compare 1963 to 1967, and just in terms of what people were wearing. So that's another reason why the fashion element and the style element of this book is so, I focused on that so much.
It's funny, it's true. Everything I interviewed a guy who wrote a book about the Beatles, but only 1963. And I thought it was really boring, but it was incredibly exciting because, like you said, so much happened in that year.
Yes.
And then playing little tiny clubs with maybe 5 people, and then, then the Cavern, etc. But everything, it's like that scene in Hard Day's Night where George, who walks into the wrong room and they start showing him clothes.
Yes. Oh, I love that scene. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, George was really good in that scene. They were natural actors.
He was, yeah.
But yeah, it's like if you're thinking about this, and I don't think a lot of people today would understand why. And I said as in the introduction, these have to be hidden figures, that you can't tell anybody what's going on, especially John. But it was such a different sensibility at the time. And I think that goes, when I read the book, I'm thinking, oh, she's being too mean about Keith and Mick. They were good guys, they weren't bad guys, but in the book, sometimes they just seem like they're just really bad guys.
Well, especially Mick, it's funny that you say that, because as during the course of writing the book and even afterwards, I was kind of worried that I romanticized Keith too much, that I thought anybody who reads this book is going to think I'm in love with Keith Richards, which maybe is true. He's definitely my favorite Stone. I think that I saw him, and maybe still see him, as in a way the good guy in the book, to Mick's like bad guy, just in terms of how they treated women and their temperament in terms of how they do their relationships with women. You know, Keith was and is, I think, much more of a monogamous, sort of like romantic, and Mick is not, you know, and you see that in the book. But you know, if anything, I actually think that I held back a little bit because I did, in terms of not wanting to make them seem too awful or come down too hard on them, but I really was just telling the truth, you know, that it's fact, kind of.
Yeah, it's like Paul McCartney and John Lennon. John Lennon treated his wife horribly,
Yes.
but Paul seemed much kinder. And Keith, at the same time, also felt like, especially when he's first getting to know Anita, he's very kind to her.
Oh,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't think he caused. Well, talk about how the switch came, how she went from Brian directly to Keith, and
Yes.
although you do say that Keith and Mick treated Brian horribly too, so
Right, right. There was a lot of, you know, there was a lot of bullying going on in the Stones well before Anita even came on the scene. In terms of Mick and, in general, it was Mick and Keith against Brian, but it wasn't always that way. It was always Brian and Mick. They were always at odds, and then Keith would sort of jump back and forth, you know, which one. A lot of the time, he was kind of on Brian's side, and then they would gang up on Mick. You know, there's this misconception, I think, that and it's just part of everyday sexism, that women and girls are catty and are with each other. But I have never even read or heard about the level of cattiness and bitchery that was like happening on the level of the Stones. You know, like early Stones, and the fighting. It was hard to even imagine. And sadly, I think that, you know, Brian's descent into drugs was partly caused by that. You know, Brian Jones was, and another sad aspect of this story, there are many sad aspects of it, is that Brian Jones was physically abusive to Anita, and towards the end of their relationship, and that was one of the reasons why reason why she ultimately left him for Keith. And I think that she was, and she has said this in interviews, she was already falling in love with Keith at that point, you know, and I think that Brian knew it. Keith was living with Brian and Anita in their flat in Chelsea at the time, because he had just his girlfriend had just left him for Jimi Hendrix, and he was sad, you know, moping, living on the couch, and then, you know, they just kind of slowly, as friends, Keith and Anita, sort of fell in love from a distance.
I never thought about the violence before because I didn't know anything about it. But the thing that I was thinking, could he have actually hit her in the face several times? And it just seemed like, I don't know, it just seemed way over the top. I can see, you know, pushing or slapping, maybe this idea of hitting her in the face and bruises and all. I never suspected that from.
It was right. It was horrible. And I don't see how anybody who wasn't in that inner circle would have known about it at the time, because you know, you didn't talk about that sort of thing then. It was the dialogue around domestic violence was very different. You know, Brian maybe he, for whatever reason, maybe he thought he was losing Anita. I think that he could have been just a violent man towards women, but he treated her terribly on this trip to Morocco. And that was a wild chapter to write, actually, that road trip that Brian and Keith and Anita took, starting in Paris, and they drove all the way through France. Brian developed some sort of lung infection, and they leave him in this town in the Pyrenees, I think near Toulouse. And then Keith and Anita drive on into Spain and just kind of fall in love in Spain. By the time Brian joins them in Tangier, you know, he can sort of suspect what's going on. Anita is still staying in Brian's suite, and then the violence happens, and she lives Morocco with Keith, and kind of like the rest is history. You know, it's for 13 years, more or less, they're together.
It's funny, you remember, well, I do, you don't by 30 years. When John F. Kennedy was president, you know, he's having all these affairs and doing other things, and the press it was like a tacit agreement. The press would not talk about it. And they never did. And I thought it was the same way with the press in Great Britain, but a lot of this stuff about Marianne Faithfull and Anita came out. And I don't remember coming out when I was around, but it did. It must have.
Yes, I think that I think that a lot of this, the more sordid aspects of this story sort of came out slowly in the 80s, you know, and in the 70s, kind of like bit by bit in retrospect, especially after Anita and Keith, when once their relationship sort of started to deteriorate, and well, you can trace the beginning of the end of their relationship all the way back to 1968 when that brief affair with Mick and Anita happened. But later on, when things really started to fall apart in the later 70s, I think that, you know, the press started to certainly, and this is what's very sad, attack Anita more, you know, and sort of blame her just in the same way, you know, in the, I know much less about this, but the Beatles, when Yoko Ono was kind of blamed, it's always like blame the woman, and or much earlier, you know, Anita was able to maintain that lifestyle and for a long time, but Marianne Faithfull fell apart faster, you know, sooner, starting in 1969. And the press was just brutal towards her. I mean, when I was doing my research, the horrible things that I would see about her, that just talking about her drug use and describing terrible things about the way she looked. And, you know, we're all used to seeing this, that, you know, she looked like a mess, or she, you know, and then that it was very, very sad to see.
You know, I tend to go, I think of something, I go off on tangents. And that made me think of the scene where you talk about Tina Turner and trying to teach Mick how to dance that dance. And Tina Turner's another one like that, because Ike treated her horribly, and she never, until she divorced him, was understood about that. But go ahead and talk about how he was doing that, and the Ikettes coming to the party and all that.
Oh yeah, I love that anecdote. And it was back in 1966, I think, in the fall, at a Stones concert, and Mick and Marianne hadn't gotten together yet. Marianne Faithfull actually was married and had a child very young. You know, she was still a teenager. She was 18 or 19 when she got married. It's crazy how these, you know, people seem to live so many lives, you know, like they by the time they're 25, so much has already happened, you know. It's from today's perspective, it's just very different. But anyway, Mick and Marianne, you know, Mick is I think still dating Chrissy Shrimpton, the younger sister of the model Jean Shrimpton, and but he has his eye on Marianne Faithfull, who is you know, this folk pop sort of angel angel voiced singer. And she's at the concert backstage, and she's watching Tina Turner sort of like teach Mick how to dance. And if you watch Mick Jagger from the very beginning, he was such a great dancer, and he really learned that from watching people like Tina Turner.
Yeah, it's amazing you talk about time. I mean, I saw the Stones like 2 months ago.
Oh, wow, lucky you.
I know, and it was more of an anthropological experiment on my part, because I wanted to see how they really sounded. And I got seats right on the first row of that, you know how they come out on that runway and they do their little acoustic set. Yeah. And so I wanted to see them up close. And I'm thinking, they can't be doing this good. There has to be some computer algorithms making it sound good. But I'm not quite sure about it. You got to remember, at my age, I saw them in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 2000s.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So it's like 64 years. And and the funniest thing is, you're talking about what discord was in the band in the 60s, and then here they are in 2024 still together.
That is wild to think. I mean, it's crazy to even think that it's so unusual for a band to even be doing that, even that they lasted until 1980 is crazy. And then so many years later.
Yeah, it's I think they're just, you know, they're like soldiers who have been in their army for 60 years, and that's the way they're going to go out too.
That's definitely what it feels like, right?
Yeah, definitely. But anyway, so there are so many incredible stories here. but we just started talking about Marianne. So let's talk a little bit about her and how I knew her as from As Tears Go By, which the Stones wrote for her.
Oh, so you actually remember the early Marianne Faithfull?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's
I'm
so
72 years old, for God's sakes.
Oh gosh, okay. So you are my pronunciation. So right, that is that generation. Yes, for this. Yeah,
Yeah. And
remember her.
talk about, again, when you go to the clothes, talk about the difference between Marianne Faithfull's clothes and Anita's clothes.
Yes, especially in the beginning, right? Where or when they first they kind of came on the scene at the same time in more or less. Marianne Faithfull, she didn't come on the scene as Mick Jagger's girlfriend before they started dating. He and Keith wrote As Tears Go By for Marianne Faithfull, and she did that song first, because of course the Stones did their own version of it, which is also quite beautiful. But they wrote this, as the story goes, the first Stones, oh gosh, why is my brain, the first manager, what was his name? Andrew Oldham.
Andrew Lowe Golden. Yeah.
Yeah, he apparently locked Mick and Keith, or so he says, into a kitchen overnight and said, write a song tonight. And they came up with As Tears Go By, and Marianne Faithfull recorded it. And I think that it's that is just such a haunting song. I love that song. I love her voice in that song. I another thing that I think that Andrew Oldham had said years later was that he when he sort of gave Mick and Keith like an idea or a brief or like a prompt for the song As Tears Go By, he said, write a song that brings to mind sort of like unrequited love, high convent walls, and doves. And I love, I just, as somebody who has a very poetic imagination, I just love that, high convent walls. And when you think about that Marianne's version of that song, it totally brings that to mind, right? It's this wistful, longing innocence, yet lost innocence. Anyway, I could talk about that song forever. I just have always loved it. But Marianne Faithfull came on the scene as a folk and pop star, and her clothes, if you look at her look at that time in 1965, it's so typical of the high fashion, like the women's fashion of that time, edgy women's fashion of that time. And I love that look. There's this famous picture of Marianne Faithfull, I think it's, again, 1965, in a pub in London, I think called the Salisbury, maybe, I'm not entirely sure. And she's in this booth and she's wearing these delightful little knee socks and a mini skirt and sort of maybe like a little bow or a tie around the neck. She also wore those long sort of Grecian type dresses. I remember there's a photo of her maybe at the San Remo Jazz or Pop Festival, of her singing in this lovely, like long kind of pink, long sleeve Greek type dress, simple kind of dress. And, but then just like Mick and Keith, very quickly, once she started dating Mick and I think one of my favorite things about writing this book was the friendship between Anita and Marianne, because they became friends, sort of like, in a way they were their own like soldiers on the battlefield, having to weather these constant storms. They were also so suited to each other in terms of friends. I mean, that's kind of my favorite romance of the book. And just like Mick and Keith, she ended up dressing kind of like Anita, and wearing Anita's clothes on this famous trip to Morocco, where in 1967, where Marianne was having her own problems. She was, and I love this part of the story, she and Anita were packing together because Anita flew back to get Marianne. And this whole thing was so chaotic. And Marianne, they were on acid while packing Marianne's suitcase for the trip, as they, of course. And Marianne, I think, put in her suitcase a scarf or a sarong, some seashells, and a book of fairy tales. So she was wearing Anita's clothes the whole time.
It's funny, I didn't remember, but I remember this too, when they all wore those fake eyelashes, eyeliner, and the falls that they wore. And it was like, that was the de rigueur uniform. And then if they did cry or something, the eyeliner like that.
And the lashes hanging off, the fake strips of lashes.
Oh, yeah,
hanging.
right. Yeah. But I had forgotten all about that, which was mod. And, I
Yeah.
even had someone bring me back something from Carnaby Street. Oh, to talk about how old I am, I had the Meet the Beatles album on VJ Records before Capitol, before Apple Records. And,
Oh my gosh. Wow.
and I ended up throwing it away at some time. It would probably be worth a lot of money now, but, so if you're talking about the sartorial, well, let's look at it this way. Instead of talking about the sartorial, and you're talking about what could be considered a love affair between Marianne and Anita, the sex is rampant, but it doesn't seem like jealousy like in Fleetwood Mac. It doesn't seem as like jealousy was part of it. It was just, okay, you slept with her, you slept with him. Okay, it's over, that's done.
Yeah, exactly. And and from as I'm doing the research for this book, I found myself constantly kind of confused, thinking, how how are people not seething with rage, heartbroken, jealous? I mean, from a modern, right, or I think from most people's perspectives, how can you even like go on not only in a relationship but as a band while that everybody is constant with each other and switching things out. And I asked I posed this question to Chris O'Dell when I interviewed her, and she said, and then I felt so naive when she said this, but she said it was a totally different time. She said it was the night we were young, it was the 1960s. We just didn't see things that way back then.
Yeah,
And and I thought that was really interesting. I guess it really was a different time. But I will say, and Marianne, and there are certain people in the book that have much more of that 60s free love ethos than others. Marianne Faithfull, Marsha Hunt, Anita, very much the free love 60s. Keith, not so much, because there's still, just it was a different time. It was the 60s, but these are still people with feelings, right? So during the filming of Performance, when Anita and Mick slept together, Keith was heartbroken. And that's how the song Give Me Shelter came about. He was drinking whiskey in a car with the rain coming down, knowing that they're doing these, filming these sex scenes together, that being encouraged by, why can't I think of it? I'm sorry, I can't think of the director's name. And Keith is heartbroken over this. And even though, their relationship continued many more years, they had Marlon and their children, I don't think that it recovered from that betrayal.
Yeah, it's funny. What I did during the book was anytime you mentioned a song, I just went to Spotify and played it. And then I listened to Memo from Turner. I hadn't heard that song in years, and I loved that song.
Yes.
And a performance, and it was almost like Mick was trying to be in movies in order to compete with
Marianne, who was an actress.
Right.
Anita and Marianne were both actresses. I think that I'll go out on a limb and say I think that Marianne was more compelled by acting more and a little more dedicated to it. I think that Anita was, as she approached many things in life, was having fun with it. We just sort of I think that they had two different approaches that way. And I think, but they were both quite talented. And Mick saw that in Marianne especially, and definitely was competing with her. I think that he competed with Marianne and Anita as much as he competed with Keith and Brian.
Yeah, it's funny how you talk about when Anita is acting, she acts just like she does everything else. And even if a movie star was bigger than her, they would all still be intimidated by her. And
yes.
I do know that look, and I'm trying to think of someone I know. I can think of a couple of people who were like that. Like we talked before, I don't want to beat a dead horse, about walking into the room. And she was the same when she was acting.
Oh my God. Yeah.
She was not a person with insecurity. She was not a person that was like divided. She was totally integrated. And that was
that's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it. And you can't there's nothing, if there was an elixir or a pill that I could take to become that, I would pay all the money in the world to have that Anita quality. There's nothing, and you can't, you either have it or you don't. And I think that just a tiny percentage of people have it. I can see why people like Mick would have been, I think she would be a hard person not to envy, because even from an actor's perspective, she wasn't a tortured person. Like she wasn't, as a writer, as an artist, I'm definitely not the effortless one. I'm like beating my head against the wall, tortured writing this stuff. And I'm just thinking, why can't I have that Anita quality and just kind of do things effortlessly, just do things like as if it were just sort of a game, and have it just come off beautifully. And she did. And how could you not be envious of that? I think that Mick definitely envied her.
Yeah, it's like all of them, to a certain extent, more than others, each one more than others. You have these things, you have anxiety, you have guilt, you have remorse, you have shame. If she ever did anything like that, that was then.
Yes.
She lived in the moment.
Yes. What a incredible quality to have. And yeah. I really think that's actually, I think you hit the nail on the head. That's one of the things that gave her the ability to live how she lived, and to have that confidence and to have that charisma. I think that everybody in this story has an incredible amount of charisma, but she definitely had a very hypnotic sort of quality, and she was really just so much fun. She was really like a rock star, and she was called the Sixth Stone at the time. Even in the moment, at the time, she was called the Sixth Stone. Mick, he might have been envious of her. I think that he had a lot of complicated feelings towards her. He wanted to be with her romantically because when they hooked up on the set of Performance, I think it probably only happened once or twice. She definitely did not want to continue things with him. She wanted to stay with Keith. I think that she thought Mick was kind of ridiculous in a lot of ways, and she just wasn't drawn to him, But Mick wanted to pursue things with Anita and keep things going. He would have left Marianne for Anita. And, here's another thing that's so interesting. So Marianne is and they're very sad for Marianne. She's pregnant with Mick's child, and she's having a miscarriage. She miscarries, a terrible late miscarriage during the filming of Performance while Mick is sleeping with Anita. Yet Marianne's friendship with Anita totally lasts. It doesn't skip a beat. None of this missed a beat. In fact, a couple months later, they're all heading off, the four of them, on a couple's trip to Brazil. And it's crazy it's like, how is this even happening? But of course, the subject that, Marianne actually was suffering quite a bit on that trip. She wasn't angry towards Anita at all, but she was emotionally struggling, I think, with how Mick had betrayed her, and just where, she could tell their relationship was falling apart, and it was a tough time for her, the beginning of a tough time.
What really tells the story is that here we are 60 years later, and who have we been talking about for the past 30 minutes? Just her.
I know.
So it's amazing. Well, let's switch to someone else, even though I'd rather continue talking. A good segue would be Bianca Jagger, because of the way Anita, behind her breath, says these horrible things about her. And she was another one that stood alone, because she, there are three different kinds of people here, completely different. Talk a little bit about Bianca, because when she came about, I felt a little bit like you may have intimated that she was like the Yoko, in a way.
It's interesting that it's funny, because I would never link those two women together, but that's funny, and I can see it. If only, and perhaps unfairly, I think I'll say a couple things, and maybe I shouldn't even say this, but Bianca is she's a fascinating person in her own right, but I definitely spent the least amount of time on her in the book. And at this point in the relation, in the story, you know, Mick and Keith have a, like, you know, to say again, there's so many romances in this story, right? Even if they're not sexual. Like, I feel like there's the Mick and Keith romance, there's the Anita and Marianne romance, but Mick and Keith at this point, by the time Mick meets Bianca, are definitely not thick as thieves. Their lifestyles are becoming quite different. You know, 1970, Mick has never been a big drug user ever, you know, and Keith and Anita are going further and further into drug use, just kind of what we think of as that late 60s, 70s rock lifestyle. So Mick is distancing himself from that. He's still officially with Marianne, but I think we skipped an important part, his relationship with, he's already had a child with Marsha Hunt, and we can go back to that. And then he meets Bianca at the end of 1970, I guess. And he definitely, you know, Anita and Bianca do not like each other. Keith and Bianca do not like each other. Bianca is totally different than the rest of this rock and roll stuff. She doesn't like rock music at all. She finds, I think that she was kind of like she was disturbed by Anita and Keith. She wasn't into the drug use. She was very glossy, high fashion. She wanted to be around, like, well, of course the Stones were already quite wealthy. They've been wealthy this whole time, but she wanted to be around very, people would call it, the expression that people today would use is bougie. I don't even like that word, but like, you know, very glossy, shiny people, if that makes any sense. High fashion, the type of thing you'd see in a glossy fashion magazine, right? Not on a rock stage. She wasn't, and whereas Anita is like, you know, has a baby and baby Marlin in one arm, banging a tambourine with another on the stage while like high as a kite on their Goodbye England tour. So totally different types of people. And I think that if she was part of the divide between Mick and Keith, you know, in that Yoko Ono type way, it was only because that was already happening. And Mick was already at that point becoming and he was already going down that path, becoming interested in a different kind of high fashion, not like I said, the type of fashion you're going to see in a fashion magazine, glossy, shiny, smooth, moving away from that gritty, grungy rock and roll lifestyle. So, you know, there was a very, and of course, like that, their relationship between Mick and Keith wasn't the same after that. That was another divide.
It's funny how you talked about children. In addition to the clothes, the drugs, children are fly through this book, and then they're hidden, and then they fly back in. Mick has 8 children by maybe each of these partners, and Jerry Hall.
Yeah. And you know, then there was and his first child, Karis Jagger, you know, he had with Marsha Hunt. That's a very interesting story. And Marsha was fascinating to me. She's also the only American woman in this book. And she was American, living in the UK, writing her own music, performing with various different bands, singing. And also she really was noticed for her role in the musical Hair. I forget what year that was, maybe 67.
It was in prep school. It was 68.
And so she caught, she also, like all of these women were gorgeous, and they all worked as models. I forget if Bianca did, but anyway, Mick approached her to be on to pose on the cover of Honky Tonk Woman, and she refused because she didn't like what that represented. She didn't want to be, you know, his idea for the photo shoot was not what she had in mind, you know, but they became friends. And another thing, to go back to, you know, the difference of the ethos of the Three Love 60s, I think that I've hardly ever heard of this happening. They decided to have a child together out of friendship. And I mean, a romantic friendship, obviously, but friendship. And the idea was never for them to stay together or live together. They were going to co-parent together, of course. That was the idea. That is not what ended up happening, very sadly. But I found that so interesting too, that from Marsha's perspective, what a brave thing to do, what a progressive thing to do. She was probably the most progressive in a lot of ways of all of these women. She went to college at Berkeley. She was at the time the most like politically active. So she had a very different idea of love and romance. When you read her memoirs, she was never that. I think she loved being around Mick as a friend, but she was not ever head over heels for him. But they had this, I think, very idealistic idea of how they were going to raise a child and co-parent together, but not be involved. They were going to do things a different way. Marsha was very interested in how this, that young generation was finding out different ways of living. But Mick met Bianca while Marsha was still pregnant, and that would have been fine, but Mick completely shirked off responsibility from the very beginning. And that was the worst, one of the worst things in this book, I think. My God, that was awful.
Yeah, I know it was. And it made me think about how, as much as I was there to read everything, and I thought I was really good at it at the time, and I knew nothing about Marsha Hunt. I was thinking, why don't I?
Right.
I don't know if it's because.
I know that I've seen pictures of her and she had been in a lot of fashion magazines and things like that. But I didn't know about her involvement with the Stones. Now, I will say Marsha was not a Stones fan, really. She wasn't a fan of their music. Bianca wasn't either. Marsha was she loved Tina Turner. She was more interested in Motown musical artists and some other experimental musical artists. She had a bluesy sort of background. But she also was not a drug user. So she also was not going to be hanging out with Keith and Anita at all. So she didn't spend time with the band really, like Anita and Marianne did. But she was kind of erased from Stone's history. And what's also really, I think was also difficult for her is she was all of these women were facing sexism. Marsha was also facing racism. And I think that played a part in how the press treated her when, in the 1970s, when Mick was not even supporting Karis financially. So, she definitely struggled a lot, but still, had a absolutely fascinating life and continued to make music and play in different bands and, live a great life despite it.
It's funny, going back to the fact that I didn't know who she was. She grew up in Mount Airy, which is my neighborhood. She grew up like 5 blocks away from me.
Oh, Philadelphia.
Yeah, Philadelphia, North Philadelphia. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I probably know exactly where she lived. Is she still around?
Yes. Yeah, she is. She is. And what's also what I like about Marsha is she brings a different element to this book. And that's why I think that I know that I definitely talked about her background much more than any of the other women. Because she brought that sort of American music and to the book. And something that I really liked that she talked about was Bandstand, was the show Bandstand, and how she grew up sort of like watching that and dancing to it. And if you see Marsha Hunt like on stage or like videos of her, she's such a great dancer.
Yeah, obviously, since I was from Philadelphia, am from Philadelphia. Yeah, Bandstand was, we had to watch it every time it was on. And I can see exactly why she felt that way. And then you'd have groups on like The Doors. And Dick Clark didn't know how to interview these people. He didn't even know what their music was about. But it was great that he had them on. And
that's so wild. Bandstand started in the 50s, right? In the
Yep.
mid
Yeah.
50s.
Yeah. Yeah. It started with like, the Beach Boys. Well, that was the 60s, but it was the very early 60s as well. And the other thing that was interesting is in 1963, when the Beatles gave the Rolling Stones their first hit. I forgot what song it was that he gave them, but Beatles gave away a lot of songs, and one of them was, yeah, I forgot it. Oh, one was to Peter Asher. I forgot. And I won't stay in a world without love, but yeah, it's
I didn't know the Beatles wrote that song.
hmm?
They wrote that song, the Beatles?
Yeah. If you look up on YouTube songs that the Beatles wrote for other people.
Oh, I had no idea. That's such a lovely song.
There's like 23 of them.
Oh.
And Peter Asher is still living off the Beatles in a way because of his Sirius station and his top 100. But he always has to tell stories about the Beatles as if he was the most important part of that story. So you don't put Jerry Hall in the book. You give like a paragraph about her. And she was another one. She's someone who would want to be on an album cover. And she was going with Brian Ferry of Roxy Music. She is on that cover, like a mermaid almost.
Yes.
But yeah, you mentioned it, but it doesn't sound like really most of the women in the book really were interested or cared for the music that their lovers made.
Anita definitely did. She
Right.
liked music, and she not only did she like it, she had opinions about it. I love this anecdote about Mick approaching Anita. I think it was during the remixing or mixing of Beggar's Banquet, and she gave him an opinion on Stray Cat Blues, and said, there's too much trouble. You need to give it, do this or do that, and he went along with her advice. He valued her opinion. The rest of the women, I think that Marianne did like the music on some level, but Marsha and Bianca definitely were not Stones fans. And I think another important thing to say is, and this goes for all four of the women, they all had tremendous influence on the Stones, as we said, especially Anita. But none of them, not a single one, none of them were trying to influence the Stones. They had an influence on the Stones despite themselves. Anita, of course, was very aware that she must have been, that she was playing a role here and influencing, but that's not what that wasn't her. She was just doing that because that was her, and how do what they weren't doing? They weren't, and I say this in the introduction of my book because I really want to, it's important for me to make this distinction. None of them were, especially not Anita, none of them were the, there's this trope of the rock star wife that's keeping the hearth going at home, or like helping or tirelessly working behind the scene. Like that's not what these women were doing. They were not, they were not working to make the Stones famous or working to make the Stones better. They were just, as you would say today, living their best lives, and just by being in their proximity, the Stones just absorbed all their magic.
There's a very good bibliography at the end of the book showing some of the sources you relied on. Other than the bibliography, who did you speak to personally, if any?
I did speak to some people who need to remain off the record, but as I said, I talked several times to Chris O'Dell. Robert Greenfield, who was with the Stones in Villefranche in the south of France in the summer of 1971. That's another wild time that came towards the end of the book, and unfortunately, a lot of the sources that I did speak to personally did insist on remaining off the record.
Right. It's funny that there's this TV show on now. I don't know if you know about it. It's called Slow Horses. Mm-hmm. And the theme song is sung by Mick at 80 years old. And it's really good.
I didn't know that.
I think you might like it. It's called Slow Horses. It's about M5 Secret Service in London, and about a bunch of people who have screwed up, and they're relegated to this dark, dingy office, and how they somehow solve crimes, even though they don't really have the way to do it. Anyway,
And so how does Mick's voice sound now? Well, you also saw him in concert recently.
well, that's the thing. I mean, I read a lot about how, he'd walk around, and then when he got up to the microphone, it was just as if it was, the beginning. And the song, that song sounds great. And in the concert, like I said, I really couldn't believe it. I still, I'm half and half. Did they doctor the music as it went from the microphone to the amp? But other than that, I would have to say they sounded as good as they did 20 years ago.
Wow, isn't it's incredible. I mean, isn't he 80? He's 80 years old. And how did they appear? How did Mick appear on stage? Was he dancing or just kind of?
Yeah, he was doing everything he did. Might have been a beat slower, but he was still running both ends of the stage and then coming out to the end of the stage. And they did a lot of stuff from the new album, which is amazing to think that they actually have a new. Yeah.
What a great name for an album. I love that.
Yeah, so do I. I love when they reference back,
Yes.
where they came from.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I guess as we wind down, I mean, all three of the books you've written are about icons, people that shaped the culture. I mean, Marilyn did, to lesser extent as far as people who knew her. Sylvia Plath definitely did, including me the first time I read The Bell Jar. But yeah, and then now this. So who are you going to tackle next, if anybody?
I am very interested in doing something completely different and going back much, much further, because all three of my books have been, I guess you could say, mid-century time period. The first two books took place in the mid-1950s. This past one, a couple decades later. But I want to go back a few centuries and write about some iconic women in maybe even the 16th century, like, for example, the 16th century French Queen Margot, Catherine de Medici's youngest daughter. There are so many women in history who have histories like full of these women who are we just see these like glimpses of, who led these incredible lives. And I'm endlessly interested in like recovering them.
Yeah, it's like I was interviewing a guy who wrote a book about genetics and how life evolved. And when he gets to the DNA part, it's Watson and Crick. But there's really a woman behind them who actually did all the research.
Wow.
They got the Nobel Prizes and she was completely ignored. Or as I referred to, the term I used, hidden figures, like the women who helped the Apollo program.
I had no idea about that. Yeah, the women in science alone, it's incredible how many. I feel like every day I'm discovering. Or just last night I went down a music rabbit hole, and I was reading about the musical artist Big Mama Thornton, and just like, I mean, she was incredible, and the Stones, there's that one, the Stones did her song, they probably did a few of her songs, Little Red Rooster. But if you listen, and I love there's a video recording of that, and Mick is great in that, but listening to Big Mama Thornton's recording, that was off the charts, incredible.
It's so funny. I watched it last night, Little Red Rooster, on the Ed Sullivan Show in '65.
Yes, that's the one that I'm thinking of. Yeah.
That's funny. Well, that's, like I said, I mean, the book is so comprehensive and deals so much with, like I said, clothes that I wouldn't expect that to have been in, the babies I didn't expect, and the drugs I knew about, but I didn't know the extent of how many they would do in one day and still survive.
It's mind blowing. Like, I mean, I think that everybody has a different like tolerance for how long they can endure that sort of thing. And then it's funny because in the book you see different people tapping out at different years, and Anita just outlasts them all. There's another thing a writer said about Anita, I forget which one, that she out-Keithed Keith. She
walking around with 19 Tuinals in her purse, and I remember Tuinals and I remember second holes too. I was on the end of that curve, but yeah, that's amazing. in any event, thank you so much for being here. The book was great because it reminded me of so many things that most people aren't around to remember. And you did a great, and also the Maryland book was eye-opening as well. So, and I got to read Sylvia Plath's book now too.
Oh, thank you.
And
Thank
we'll
you.
have them all in the bookstore. And I think we've been carrying yours since, when did it come out? October last year?
It came out in July of last year. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's been out for just over a year. Yeah. I'm always, it always makes me so happy to see my book in bookstores, especially Parachute Women. I'm really proud of it.
Well, as a bookseller, covers make a big difference, and it's a great cover.
I
And
love that cover. I can't take credit for it, but I was so happy when they showed me, is this, do you like this one? It's just,
I know. I
thought
always
it was
thought when I was younger, I always thought, well, the author picks the cover. And yet
I used to think that too. And then until I became an author, and then I realized it's not the case.
it's like you're the chef, and because you're the chef, you think you can do the cover, but it's two completely different jobs. And publishing houses do the cover because they want the cover to sell the book. That's the
Yeah.
main reason.
Yes. And of course we want them to sell books too, but sometimes you can be at odds with if you don't like a cover, and then that's difficult. But if somebody still loves to shop in bookstores, like in person, of course you're drawn to a book's cover, right? So yeah.
It's exactly the opposite of the cliche,
Yes.
because I've been doing this long enough that I know what to put on the front table. You put on the front table books that have great covers.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I hope that we'll talk again when you finish your next book.
Oh, yes, that would be great. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a
You're
pleasure.
welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.